Once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. The latest now from the Vatican. Pope Francis met with his cardinal advisors on curial reform this week. In the wake of the latest mishandling of the clerical abuse crisis, Cardinal Sean O'Malley offered a proposal for regional tribunals to hear cases of sex abuse. The Vatican has a backlog of some 1,800 yet to be investigated abuse cases. The tribunals would assist in processing those. Spokesman Greg Burke said final judgment on such cases would remain with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Also discussed cost containment and reduction of the Holy See's deficits and a, quote, healthy decentralization of authority across the Universal Church. The Council of Cardinals meets again in April. And healthy or not, a decentralization of church authority seems to be well underway. The bishops of Germany have voted overwhelmingly in favor of producing a guide for Protestant spouses on the reception of Holy Communion in Catholic churches. Under certain conditions, bishops' conferences agreed, or that bishops' conference agreed, that a Protestant partner of a Catholic can receive the Eucharist after having, one, made a serious examination of conscience with a priest or another person with pastoral responsibilities, two, affirming the faith of the Catholic Church, and three, wishing to end serious spiritual distress, and finally, that they have a longing to satisfy a hunger for the Eucharist. Accompanying them to an RCIA program is not part of the directive. And the prefect for the Congregation for Divine Worship is taking a slightly different approach to the Eucharist. Cardinal Robert Sarah is again calling for greater respect for the Blessed Sacrament. In the preface of a new book on the subject, he asked rhetorically, why do we insist on communicating standing in the hand? Why this attitude of lack of submission to the signs of God? He goes on, the most insidious diabolical attack consists in trying to extinguish faith in the Eucharist, sowing errors and favoring an unsuitable manner of receiving it. Truly, the war between Michael and his angels on one side and Lucifer on the other continues in the heart of the faithful. Satan's target is the sacrifice of the Mass and the real presence of Jesus in the consecrated host, he said. And 18 months after a disastrous earthquake in central Italy, a tabernacle with 40 intact consecrated hosts was found in the rubble. It's being described as a Eucharistic miracle. A local parish managed to open the locked tabernacle using an extensive collection of keys. They found the body of Christ, which was there for more than a year and a half, remained intact without any change in color, shape, or scent. Typically, decay or mold would have developed. The local bishop has submitted the case to the Vatican's Congregation for Divine Worship in the hopes that they will declare it a miracle. And the Vatican Post Office revealed its choice for their annual Easter postage stamp. The image is by Spanish artist Raúl Berzosa, and it depicts a rather buff and robust Jesus shedding his robes and looking up to heaven. The German Bishop's News website described it as a, quote, gym Jesus with muscle-bound arms causing women's hearts to beat faster, end quote. The artist's work has been chosen by the Vatican before. In 2016, for the 80th birthday of Pope Francis, it was a lot more traditional and less revealing. Here with analysis of all of this and more is the editor of Catholic World News and the author of the controversial new book, Lost Shepherd, How Pope Francis is Misleading His Flock. Welcome back to the program, Philip Lawler. Phil, thanks for being here. I want to get into first some breaking news. Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the former head of the CDF, this week really wagging a finger at his fellow German bishops, suggesting that they've gone too far in offering communion to those outside of the faith. They're using a line, and he cited it, that for Protestant spouses of Catholics in individual cases, they may communicate. And he says this is a rhetorical trick, and it's a way to get around intercommunion because this is only supposed to happen in grave spiritual need, right, and that the German bishops are expanding that beyond recognition. Your reaction?
It's exactly right. It's a symptom of what's going on throughout the Church. And I think it's a symptom of what I'm trying to get at in this book, is that Pope Francis has created enough confusion so that there is a huge space for maneuver for people who want to, one way or another, sort of take an end run around church moral teachings.
Using this idea of accompaniment and this idea of mercy. And really, Amoris Laetitia ends up being the centerpiece around which all of this is built.
Yes, it is, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, if I'm a camel, in that I was originally very enthusiastic about Pope Francis, and over time became more and more concerned and dismayed and disoriented. But when I saw what happened with that synod, with the manipulation of the synod, and then with the Amoris Laetitia coming after it, I said, this is more than simply imprudence in expression. This is a deliberate effort to confuse.
Quickly explain to people what this means. Many casual Catholics watching this, they're like, what? They don't even know what Amoris Laetitia is. Explain to them. This is an exhortation on the family, teaching on the family and marriage that the Pope issued after a double consultation with his bishops over a pair of years.
Yes.
What is the problem in your estimation?
The problem is that Amoris Laetitia is intentionally unclear on the one question that everybody had topmost in their mind going into the synod, going into both meetings of the synod, which is, will the church change her perennial teaching that Catholics who are divorced and remarried illicitly cannot receive communion? The general impression, certainly created by the apostolic exhortation, is that the church has changed her teaching. Now, that, as you know, is a controversial matter, and some bishops in some places will say, yes, teaching has changed, practice has changed. Others say, no, it hasn't, and the mass are in the middle, confused.
Well, clearly, the pastoral approach has changed.
Yes.
But if you change practice, I always say, if you change practice, you change doctrine. The doctrine ends up not mattering anymore because the lived doctrine is transformed into something unrecognizable.
And that's precisely the point, because why else would Pope Francis have declined to answer the dubia, the perfectly legitimate questions from 4 cardinals, asking him for clarity? Why would you not want clarity unless your intent was to provide that fuzzy space in which people can maneuver around church teaching?
Now, some of the Pope's assistants, people who ghostwrite for him, his circle say, and I'll quote this because you write at length about some of these associates, including Archbishop Victor Fernandez, who is sometimes called the kissing bishop. He wrote that book about kissing some years ago. He said in 2015, Francis is aiming at irreversible reform. Why? Why?
Good question. I don't have the answer. I don't have the ability to look inside his head. But there's something inherently wrong with the idea of irreversible reform, unless what you mean by reform is back to the fundamentals of the Catholic faith. Because the role of the Pope is inherently to conserve, to protect the deposit of the faith.
Why did you want to write this book? I'm sure, and I've read you being open to all sorts of criticism as a result of it. What moved you to write this book?
I didn't want to write this book. What happened is, actually a year ago today, exactly, I wrote a post because I boiled over with frustration. And I wrote an essay which I entitled, "This Disastrous Papacy." And it prompted more reaction than anything else I've written in 30 years of journalism. And I said, that tells me there's a hunger out there. There are people who are very much confused and dismayed and feeling betrayed and wondering, is something wrong with them? Is something wrong with the faith? And I found that as I spoke with these people, oddly enough, they felt reassured by what I was saying. Because if you say, no, you're not crazy, yes, there is a problem, we have a problem with the Pope. Well, the church,
a bold statement, Phil.
It is a bold statement, but it's happened before.
And the title is provocative. I mean, Lost Shepherd is a heck of a title for a book about the Pope. Any reticence about calling it that? I mean,
some, yes. Of course, I don't enjoy criticizing the Pope, but there is a point at which, as I say, in a loving family, if the father has a problem, you have to confront it. Eventually, there has to be an intervention. And we need an intervention.
We are on the 5th anniversary of Pope Benedict's resignation this week. It was observed in some places. You write in the book about the election of Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis. Was it orchestrated, in your opinion?
I don't know. There were certainly some cardinals who, from their statements afterwards, give the very clear impression that they were lobbying, which is not licit. I don't know how many cardinals were lobbying, but there was some going on. I can't say I'm shocked by that. I wish it weren't the case. It was a curious election in that Cardinal Bergoglio was not one of the front runners, as you well know.
Nope.
You were there.
Yeah.
One of the people whose names were being dropped all the time.
No, he was number 15 in my briefing book of 15.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. But he had a high showing in the last conclave.
Which makes it all the more interesting that then he sort of dropped out of the picture afterwards. So it was a curious election, and then it came out fairly quickly. So I don't know what happened there.
You write in the book, I'm going to put this up on the screen. I did my best to provide assurance for my readers and sometimes for myself that despite his sometimes alarming remarks, Francis was not a radical, but was leading the Church away from the ancient sources of the faith. But gradually, reluctantly, I came to the conclusion that he was. I found I could no longer pretend that Francis was merely offering a novel interpretation of Catholic doctrine. No, it was more than that. He was engaged in a deliberate effort to change what the Church teaches. I still go back to this. Why would the Pope, his job is to protect doctrine, not remake it or create it. Why would he think he could get away with this? Or do those around him think he can, and he's being enabled or pushed or perhaps led down a path by others?
That's a very good question, and I do think that there are people surrounding this Pope who are much more radical in their beliefs than he is. It is suggestive, again, that with Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis does not directly contradict church teaching. It's in footnotes, it's in the space between the lines.
It's around the margins. And this goes to my point, and to bring up Fernandez's quote, Archbishop Fernandez's quote again about irreversible reform. Nothing he's done so far is irreversible. Another pope could come onto the throne tomorrow and roll all this back. It's not as if dogmas have shifted, or, I mean, it's pastoral practice today.
Yes.
But in time, the longer this goes on, I would agree, something has changed.
Something has changed, and although no dogma has changed, a new pope who wanted to roll it all back would have an awful lot of work to do, because the confusion that has spread throughout, people in the last week since this book has come out, have asked me a lot of questions about, has the church changed its teaching on this and that? And I say no, but they had that impression. Why? Because the lid is off.
You talk about three things that a pope can and cannot do. And I'm going to go through these. The first is a pope cannot say 2 + 2 = 5. Now, that was Father Antonio Spadaro's statement, who's a Jesuit who runs a very prominent magazine in Rome, a very close ally of the Pope, who recently, we featured him on the show a few weeks ago. From Georgetown he spoke. And why attribute that to the Pope, 2.2 + 5? Francis has never said that.
No, he didn't, but he can't. Spadaro managed to say it, which is remarkable because it's a nonsensical, literally a nonsensical statement. It is mathematically wrong. It is logically wrong. And he's intelligent enough to know that. Father Spadaro is not just anyone. He's commonly known as the Pope's mouthpiece. He writes material for the Pope. He meets regularly with him in the Doma Santa Martha. So I'm trying to illustrate by saying that the Pope cannot say something which is logically wrong. If he does, you're obviously not bound by it.
Yeah, and you have that. The Pope cannot tell Catholics what they think. Well, he can lead you to what you think, or help you shape your thinking.
And he can tell you what you should think.
Okay.
But he can't tell you what you are thinking right now. That was my point.
Okay. And the Pope cannot teach authoritatively by dropping hints, you say.
Right. Which is, in the aftermath of Amoris Laetitia, with so many demands for clarification, the Pope at one point said that the Argentine bishops who put their own statement out had it just right. Well, that's a hint. That's derivative. The Pope can speak with authority. He can't deputize that authority to another group and say, oh yeah, what you said, that's it.
They got it right. Tell me about the, and you talk about this, about the conflict between the public persona and the means of governing under this pontificate. Talk to me about that. What you've seen, do they align?
Not at all. Well, if there was one thing that was clear about the election of Pope Francis, it's that the cardinals, and again, I know you know this very well, the cardinals beforehand were talking about the need for reform
Of the Curia.
And of the economic workings of the Vatican, and for accountability and responsibility.
And Benedict stepped down because he wanted a younger man to take the reins of the evangelical side of the papacy, which means, in his mind, a lot of globetrotting. I would disagree with him, but that was in his mind what John Paul had established.
But as far as the mandate for reform, it simply hasn't happened. The Curia has not been significantly reformed. There have been some shuffling of responsibilities, but we're now 5 years in, and there's not substantial reform. As far as the economic reform, that has fallen apart completely.
And why is that? I mean, we've seen scandalous stories of people carrying valises of money out of the place. The Vatican bank heads walked out of the place, charging corruption and malfeasance that they witnessed inside, and they claim that's why they were walked out. Price Waterhouse's audit brought to an end. The head of the financial secretariat, Cardinal Pell, sent off. He's off fighting charges that had been faced 20 years ago. So what's going on? Why this chaos around the reform, not only financial, but personal, sexual, we're seeing around the edges of the Vatican?
We didn't get to that yet.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's simply a matter where, as I say, he had a mandate for reform, and it's not happening. It's not at the top of his agenda. He's doing different things. And what's happened, therefore, very unfortunately, is that the old guard at the Vatican has become even more entrenched. The Secretariat of State is even more, you would have said all-powerful before. It's even more all-powerful now. And there's less accountability than there was 5 years ago.
I want your reaction to this stamp. Have you seen this new Easter stamp that the Vatican has just released?
I'm afraid I have.
And the German Bishops' Conference, and I don't have it in front. Oh, I do have it in front of me. The German Bishops' Conference write this in their release of this. It features a Jim Jesus with muscle-packed arms and toned upper body, causing women's hearts to beat faster. Your reaction?
Not just women, unfortunately. I think it might be popular around the Vatican as well.
That's all you have to say, Phil? Okay. We can read a lot into what Phil said there. Finally, how do you advise Catholics to deal with this moment? Faithful Catholics. I get letters from some of them. They feel conflicted. They love the Holy Father. They want to be faithful believers and follow what he's saying, and yet there is this division among some of them in their hearts. Because the things they're hearing now don't square with what they've been taught and what they've lived as.
That's how I have felt for several years now. And I think first and foremost and last, you pray. You pray for the Pope, and you pray that the Pope will be acting as the Vicar of Christ and that he will preserve the Church. And you pray for the people around him, that they will help him in that regard. And as a practical matter, but fully in line with that prayer, I think you ask your own bishop to stand up and help bring clarity back in an age of confusion. And if that means saying unpopular things, well, I'm sorry, say unpopular things.
Philip Lawler, thank you for being here. Lost Shepherd, How Pope Francis is Misleading His Flock, is available at bookstores everywhere and online. It's published by Raymond.